Welcome back and hello to everyone to another episode of War Diplomacy, your favorite podcast where we discuss the most relevant geopolitical developments and international relations topics that shape our world. Today, we will delve into the dynamic landscape of Latin American politics, which is a region that has been experiencing a lot of things this year, from the emergence of figures such as Javier Milei in Argentina to turmoil and violence, chaos in countries such as Haiti and Ecuador, democratic challenges in Guatemala, not even to mention Bukele's erosion and of checks and balances in El Salvador, and so many other things coming up like the Venezuelan and Mexican elections. So the list of events is endless. And to talk about these issues today, it's Valeria de la Fuente, my colleague here at the podcast. Hello, Valeria. How are you today?
I'm doing well. I'm very happy to be back in Warrior Diplomacy in English. It's been a while. And I'm very happy to be talking about Latin American political developments. But I will let you introduce our guest for today, which I am very excited is joining us for this discussion.
Me too. And we are so honored to have Michael Shifter, former president of the Inter American Dialogue, a policy forum on Western Hemisphere affairs based in Washington, D.C., and a professor in Georgetown University. Hello, Michael. How are you? How are you doing today?
Hi, Fabio. I'm doing very well. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a pleasure to have both of you guys here with me today. I think the topic we're going to discuss it's quite interesting. Of course, that there's so many countries in the continent and so many developments going up, but we have tried to categorize them in four big trends which are shaping the continent's politics. So, as in any other episode of the podcast, we will divide the conversation in four main themes. In the first one, we're going to talk about a little bit about the emergence of the new Latin America hard right. Then we'll talk about those countries dealing with some crisis, such as Ecuador and Haiti. And then we'll finish the conversation talking about those authoritarian leading countries and full-out dictatorships in the region. So without further ado, we can go into the first block and talk about these new hard right leaders in the continent. So as many of you have heard, Bukele, Milei, these hard right politicians are starting to have some interesting relations with other politicians across not only Latin America, but the US as well. They appeared in the Conservative Political Action Conference last February that suggests an interesting relationship, an alliance between Donald Trump and these leaders of hard right politics in Latin America. Of course, there's other members that we can put in this category, such as Jose Antonio Cast of Chile, and even Bolsonaro from Brazil, that of course that he's been put outside from the political spectrum in Brazil, but he still was one of those first leaders in this particular political trend. So in Latin America, it's true that this hard right rise has been different from its counterparts in Europe and North America, but it's true that there's certain trends that we can talk about, which is mostly this fierce opposition towards reproductive and freedom of sexual orientation policies. You know, it seems like they're united by this affirmation of traditional social hierarchies. There's also this stand on being tough on crime and being really strong with citizen security. And of course, there's certain uncompromising opposition towards social democracy, which has leads to some of these leaders wanting to really make the state smaller. So there's a lot of common factors in their sense as well. There's been this sense of crisis that has helped them to rise up: corruption, economic stagnation, such as in Brazil and Argentina, gang violence in El Salvador. But of course, that all of them are different. Michael, we wanted to ask you, as you are based in DC, and there's this talk about Donald Trump coming back again. Do you think that there is a connection between the rhetoric, the policies that they claim between U.S. and Latin American right side politicians?
Well, thank you. I think it's a complex area. I think it's risky to kind of to try to simplify this, because I think really, if you look at these leaders on the hard right, to me, their differences stand out more than their similarities, although, as you mentioned, there are some similarities and there are some common themes, the social themes and security as well. But if you look at economic policy, for example, which is fundamental, and you just take President Trump with Javier Milei. Javier Milei is an economist, first of all, unlike any of the other leaders, and very much committed to kind of free market economics ideologically. And President Trump is precisely the opposite. He is an advocate of protectionism and state intervention and high tariffs that we've seen under his administration. And he's promised that if he comes back for a second term, he'll increase those tariff levels. So it's really hard to see that, at least in economic policy terms, that they're similar. So far, Nayib Bukele, who was part of the group, who was here at the CPAC conference as well in February, as you mentioned, really hasn't been very concerned about economics at all and economic policy. He's been focused on security and rounding up gang members and putting them in jail without due process and with serious human rights concerns. Bolsonaro is very much he's a military man, and what he knows about and what he cares about is the military. And I think that was an essential feature of his administration as well. And I think Cast in Chile, who I got to know a little bit, he came to the dialogue in the last election when he was running, is somebody who I think is kind of more of a neoliberal, but is more of an extreme version of that, and obviously has taken up the security issue as well in Chile. What they have in common, and I think their identification with Trump, which is clear in the case of both Milei and Bukele, and if Trump returns in January of 2025, he's going to have two strong allies in El Salvador and Argentina, is a kind of an anger and rejection of sort of traditional political elites, political parties, economic elites, and so forth. And so it's simply the sort of the characteristic of populism as more of a style, a political style, the nature of the rhetoric, the nature of the attacks and so forth. But if you really sort of go beneath the surface, I think you'll find a lot of different policy positions depending on the issue.
Although that this climate of crisis that has helped some of these leaders get to power is not completely new in the Latin American political spectrum, it might be the case that there's certain factors that has made all of these leaders ascend to power now. And something that I've discussed with Valeria a lot, because I know she's really interested, is the role of social media. I think that is a really interesting new tool that these leaders are using to enhance the way they reach audiences or new audiences. I think that the case of Nayib Bukele is the most well-known, at least in our circles, the way that he's used his strong image to address new ways to solve problems that have hit El Salvador for years is something that new leaders, I think, are starting to use as well. There's the case as well that we discussed in an episode about El Salvador and Argentina about AI being used in elections and how it's also been used to move certain perspectives on people. Valeria, I know this is a topic you really like, so I'll ask you, do you think that social media has been an important factor addressing why these leaders have ascended to power recently?
Absolutely. And I think that here it's very interesting what Michael said about the difference in their politics is mostly about, for example, economic policy, but what they actually have in common is this anger or rejection that Michael mentioned, that I think fits really well in what we're seeing with culture war issues. And these are actually the topics that are spread across social media the most. That anger, that rejection is finding these movements, and I think that it has helped rise in this context of crisis in Latin America. But Michael, I want to hear your thoughts about this. Do you think that, as Fabio asked, the context of crisis is not completely new? So what has changed that has made these leaders resonate so much among their audiences?
Well, I think what's changed is simply the poor performance of many governments that were traditional governments. I mean, you take the case of it. You can go from country to country, and if you want to stick with the hard right leaders, take the case of El Salvador, and governments of the FMLN and governments of Arena were completely failed to address the security issues. There were questions of corruption, and so I think most Salvadorans just got fed up, and so they were looking for an alternative. And Bukele came in and was really, again, what I think was most appealing about him was that he was and he is a very effective communicator. I mean, he's trained as a publicist more than anything else, which I think tells you a lot. And I think you can't understand his popularity without understanding that. It's an essential part of his formula for success, as well as bringing down the rates of homicide and creating a sense of security among most Salvadorans. But he took advantage of the disillusionment and the anger towards the two political parties, one of the right and one of the left. And in the same way, I think in Argentina, Javier Milei is again an expression of the desperation of many Argentines, many young Argentines, that he got support from because of the failures of Peronism and even the failure of the Macri government, which preceded the recent government of Alberto Fernandez. They were looking for something more radical, and I think that the chainsaw image had some resonance among his supporters, and therefore, people really wanted to try something completely different and not stick with what had been the traditional politics in that country. So I think we see, in case after case, that this is really, the pattern. It happens with leaders of the left as well. Gustavo Petro is a little bit of the product of the disillusionment with political parties in Colombia. I think in my view, this cycle, if you want to call it that, really started in Peru, where I lived in the late 1980s, and lived there with hyperinflation and a threat posed by the worst insurgency Latin America has seen, Shining Path, and the inability of not only the government of Alan Garcia, but other political parties to address that. And the result was Alberto Fujimori, who embodied anti-politics. And then it continued, and that was 1990. And then in 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected, not a very different ideological position than Alberto Fujimori. But again, he profited from the deterioration, or took advantage of the deterioration in Venezuela in the 1980s and 1990s. Venezuela, we have to remember, and we often don't acknowledge this, had two lost decades. The situation had really deteriorated dramatically. And you had this former military official, Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez, who comes in, who is also a very skilled orator and charismatic, like Nayib Bukele is, and took advantage of the failures of the two main political parties in Venezuela, the Social Democratic Party and the Christian Democratic Party, who had a chance to govern and did not deliver. So I think Javier Milei is in some ways the latest example of this cycle. Obviously, there are strong differences from country to country and leader to leader, and there is the ideological differences as well. But in my view, sort of the underlying factors there are commonalities to just this rejectionist politics, if you want to call it that, and the search for an alternative. I think we saw that in Mexico as well with the election of López Obrador. So I think that is the fundamental trend, and that continues.
I could not agree more, Michael. And I had this discussion not so long ago with another colleague in the podcast, and we decided to call this cycle the Latin American political bachata, because it seems like you go two steps to the right and then one step again to the left. And at the end there, despite choosing leaders from the right, from the left, there are systematic economic, social, or political issues that are just not solved. And I completely agree that a lot of the electorate is just trying to choose any alternative outside of the traditional political parties. And that has given rise to these outcast people that will go against the establishment and everything that has been set up. And of course, that people that are desperate and just want to look for anything except from what has been promoted to them all their lives, they go for it and they buy those tickets. I think that's one of the best ways to maybe define how political trends move in the continent. I think it's the perfect time to maybe go into transition and talk about those couple examples that we'll discuss of countries in the region that are currently in huge political, economical, and social crisis, which we're going to focus more, which are Ecuador and Haiti.
In this second block, we're going to be talking about countries in crisis in Latin America, and we're going to be focusing mainly in Ecuador and Haiti, as Fabio mentioned. Most countries in Latin America seem to exist in a perpetual state of turmoil that kind of comes in the waves that we have been discussing. However, there are some countries in the region that are facing big political, economic, and security challenges more recently. Not to mention the erosion of diplomatic relations between nations in Latin America, where aggressive rhetoric, insults have characterized relations between the leaders in the region at the expense of cooperation. Here, I want to start by talking about Ecuador. I'm going to remind our listeners of what's been happening there, although I'm sure that they've heard about it. Ecuador is currently facing a delicate political and social situation. Besides a drastic increase in violence and insecurity since 2020, economic challenges, the assassination of presidential candidate Fernando Villavicencio before the elections last August. And then we saw all of this culminate in the descent into chaos last February when the leader of one of the organized crime organizations escaped prison and sowed chaos in national TV in front of everyone in the country and internationally. And then more recently, the country is facing a conflict with Mexico. Earlier this month, Ecuadorian police broke into the Mexican embassy in Quito to arrest Jorge Glass, a former Ecuadorian vice president accused of corruption charges. He was seeking political asylum in the Mexican embassy, and the Ecuadorian police broke into the Mexican embassy to arrest him. Since then, the tensions have been escalating. Mexican President López Obrador questioned the legitimacy of Noboa's presidential election, leading Noboa to expel Mexican ambassador to Ecuador as a result. This has definitely taken a toll in the relation between Mexico and Ecuador, but I think it's fair to say that it will also have ramifications in the region and in cooperation across the region. So, Michael, I want to ask you, how do you see this situation now?
Well, I think it's really very, very serious. I think, first of all, Ecuador, there's no country in Latin America that has had such a dramatic and rapid deterioration in its security situation as Ecuador. This is something that's just happened in the last couple of years, of 3 or 4 years. And I think you have a lot of criminal actors in Ecuador that are involved in drug trade and other illicit activities, and many cartels from Mexico as well, from the Balkans as well. This is not just a regional problem, it's a transnational problem. And again, the assassination of Villavicencio was the most tragic example of this deterioration. I think it's extremely unfortunate that, given all of this and given the importance, especially that Daniel Noboa, that has the president of Ecuador, has named as its highest priority to try to get this problem of drug trafficking and criminality under control. It's hard to see that he could make a lot of progress without cooperating with Mexico and other countries in the region, because this is not just an Ecuador problem, and you need cooperation in order to address the violence that Ecuador is confronting. So by this raid of the Mexican embassy and the capture of Jorge Glass, and I would be the last to defend Jorge Glass. I followed his corruption trial. I'm friends with people that denounced Jorge Glass, and I have no doubt of his guilt and that he belongs in jail. That doesn't by any means justify what President Noboa did, ordering this police assault on the embassy, which really violates international norms that even dictatorships we've seen in Latin America of the right and the left have basically adhered to. And this is, not surprisingly, has created a lot of tension and antagonism with other governments, and was even condemned by governments not of the left, but also more kind of moderate centrist America. So this is deeply unfortunate for a government that is committed to tackling this problem and cannot do it, in my judgment, without cooperation of other countries. So it's going to hurt a lot. And the situation in Ecuador, President Noboa became very popular in the first couple of months of his administration, but I think I think some of his support is starting to wane. There have been recent assassinations of mayors in Ecuador. There's been an electricity crisis in Ecuador, and I think and President Noboa, I think, is somebody with not with a lot of political experience, frankly, and it's good to vote for outsiders who could bring us, a fresh perspective, who are not necessarily part of the political class, even though he's the son of Alvaro Noboa, who was one of the wealthiest people, banana magnate, one of the wealthiest people in Ecuador. But still, he doesn't have political experience, and to manage this profound crisis that Ecuador is confronting, I think a political strategy and political experience is essential. So I think it's unfortunate. It's also unfortunate that López Obrador is trying to exploit this to an extreme degree for his political advantage. Remember that Mexico is having an election in early June. I think that, not surprisingly, all of the Mexicans have rallied around López Obrador in this, because this was the Mexican embassy, and the question of sovereignty, of Mexican sovereignty and diplomatic protection that was violated. So it makes López Obrador more sympathetic, and I think he's going to, as we say in English, milk it for all he possibly can. So we have these attacks going back and forth. Valeria said the insults, and others have gotten into this as well. And yes, it was a serious mistake that Noboa made, but there needs to be also an understanding that these problems are getting worse, and the more that these you get into these spats and bickering, and that takes the center stage, the more you're distracted, and you can't take advantage of the opportunities that the region has. I mean, one of the things I think it's important to say is that everybody's writing reports and talking about the great potential in Latin America with the energy transition, with nearshoring, with lithium. I could make a long list, but if this is sort of the tenor of the politics and the nastiness that we see among the leaders, in my judgment, it's hard to be optimistic that these opportunities are going to materialize. And so it has real consequences, this tension, and it becomes very personal. And this is what leaders are spending their time on, which I think is very, very, very unfortunate. And it makes it hard to think that the region could take advantage of the opportunities that are out there.
This is showing that the rise of the hard right that we were talking about is not just having an impact on national politics, but it's having a tremendous impact in relations across the region, and it's eroding any mechanism for cooperation. But I really like the part you said about how political figures are, to some extent, their foreign policy is more shaped by their interest to make their own political wins than by any principles in terms of international law or national interest. So it's more driven by personal political gain.
As a Mexican national, I mean, these news were huge in the country, and I agree that due to the fact that there's elections coming up later this year, it was used mostly, as Michael has said, to gather people around the flag, which has been great for the. I mean, it's not like AMLO's party's not going to win the elections, but it definitely was a huge win in foreign policy for him. His administration has not been the biggest foreign policy-oriented one, but I mean, at least this is something that will resonate in the minds of many when they go and vote in a couple months. And yes, I think that at the end, something we talk a lot in the podcast is that 2022, 23, 24, we've seen how international norms are not being respected anymore. I mean, even in the highest peak of tensions in the Cold War, embassies in the US, in the USSR, they were respected by the other. And now, this year, I mean, we saw Israel bombing a consulate of Iran. We saw this breach of the Mexican embassy in Ecuador. I mean, the list goes on and on. And without proper international punishments, you can say, or taking this to the respective courts, we can expect these things to be repeated in the coming months. And that's something that us internationalists are just completely terrified. So hopefully these things get their proper verdicts, and if there's punishments to be taking place, they should be. But Valeria, please, let's continue. I think the next example is another interesting topic to touch. Haiti. I mean, Haiti has been in crisis as well for years, so I think it's nice to maybe talk a bit about it.
Yes, so the next case is even a more dire and delicate situation. The power vacuum that was left by President Moises' assassination in 2021, the absence of current President Ariel Henry, the lack of elections since then, the humanitarian emergency and hunger that has taken over the country and has created a vacuum that armed groups have tried to fill, and to some extent successfully done so. The UN has estimated that in just 1 week, 15,000 people were displaced from the country's capital due to the high levels of violence. It has reached 160,000 people in the last months. It's a political crisis, it's a humanitarian crisis, and it's a security crisis. And although the country now is on the path to establish a new transitional government, its future is looking very uncertain. So, Michael, my question here is what do we expect of this transitional government? For a country that has been in crisis for such a long time, there are questions about whether its political leadership or its democratic institutions still hold any power and are still ready to recover from it with this transitional government.
I mean, I think it's great to include Haiti in this podcast and focus on it. And obviously, the depth of the crisis is really without precedent. But Haiti has unfortunately, and I think should be frank, has been pretty much neglected until recently in discussions about the region and about the Americas. And Haiti is, people don't want to talk about Haiti because Haiti has had problems for a long time, and they've had disaster after disaster and the like, and earthquakes and everything else, an assassination of the president. Now it's reached the crisis point, so people are looking at it. And I include the United States in that. And the United States, of course, had supported President Henry. I think for a long time, and it was clear that was not sustainable. And I think the United States was kind of hoping that it would just somehow work itself out. And we should also note that the history of external involvement in Haiti has not been a very happy one. And there's a lot of suspicions, understandably, among many Haitians for this. And this transition council that you referred to was of course of Haitians are its members, but this of course came about as from outside the country. So I think it's a very, very small step and in the right direction. But as you say, I would say it's very shaky. I've talked to a number of Haitians who I know and people who I respect a lot, and some are more hopeful than others. It's hard for me to know who's right because I'm not there, and it's not a country I have great expertise in. So some are very, very skeptical that this is going to work. Others think that it could, and I certainly hope it does. It's you have a country that's really dominated by the gangs, and the gangs almost serve as almost a veto on anything that happens. And here you have the gang leader of all things called Barbecue. That's not a very reassuring and encouraging sign. So I think it's going to be very tough. And of course, there is a Kenyan police force that is supposed to go forward and help stabilize the situation. The United States has put some resources behind it, but clearly you can make a long list of problems in Haiti, but it's hard to make a lot of progress if you don't have minimal degree of security and control. I mean, if it's just complete lawlessness and a breakdown of everything, then you're not going to get very far in development projects and other kind of economic and social support that the country desperately needs. You need those minimal conditions. So hopefully this is again a step in the right direction. I've spoken to people who are Haitian, who live there, and I've gotten different opinions, degree. Some are just think that this is doomed to fail. Others see a chance that it could succeed, and I just hope the latter are right.
That's very interesting, Michael. I have a question about what you raised about external involvement and the toll that it has had in the region, and how at times it has been completely disregarded. And now we are seeing this urgency to install the transitional government, but to some extent it may come late. And I'm curious about where do you strike the balance of external involvement? Because as you're saying, when institutions are eroded, when the police force doesn't have the power to reach a certain level of security, you obviously need partners. But at the same time, now we're seeing, and we talked about this in one of our episodes in Spanish, how Bukele, for example, was saying that he was willing to fix Haiti. I'm curious, where do you strike the balance between having partners support this transition, but at the same time not making external involvement completely the basis of it, to the extent that whenever that external partner leaves, the government cannot sustain itself?
I think this is the sort of the art of art of external engagements, and not to come in with a sort of a heavy hand, but really from the very outset work in concert from sort of local credible leaders who sort of take the lead on this. And you're really providing a sort of a role of assisting and supporting the sort of people at the national level. Because I think, if we've learned anything, if you come in with a heavy hand and kind of impose something from outside, that's just, you're going to have a backlash. That's true in normal circumstances, but in Haiti, it's particularly so, given, as I said, the unhappy history. We know of the history of the UN missions there, and the cholera and the sex scandals and everything else, that has understandably has led to enormous suspicion and resentment. At the same time, there needs, Haiti has shown that the domestic forces are not able to sort of come together. There's a lot of bickering within Haiti, and different political factions and personal politics and so forth. And then this country is just descending into complete catastrophe. And so you can't sort of sit idly by and see that happen either. So I think it's the art of how do you begin to become involved, to be supportive from the outside, but to be very clear that you're working with a group of Haitians. And I think this transitional council is an effort to do that. I think this is an attempt to do that. I think it's late. President Henry was clear that he had absolutely no legitimacy and no credibility in Haiti for a long time, but he was there, and so the United States was just kind of going along with it. And also, one point I should add is that and this was a very disappointing reaction here in the United States to this dissent in Haiti was the possibility of that a total collapse would increase migration to the United States. So already the numbers have increased substantially, but a collapse could mean that all Haitians would head towards the United States. And of course, the U.S. is worried about that, especially as we approach have an election year. I was disturbed to see the other day, and there was a news article, I don't know if it's true, I hope it's not true, that the United States has now begun deporting Haitians here back to Haiti. If that's true, there was a news article to that effect. I hope that's not true. If it is, I think that would be a very unfortunate and a serious mistake, and probably a violation of law. I mean, there's just no way to return Haitians now, deport them back to Haiti in the midst of these very dire circumstances. Just seems to be unacceptable.
Yeah, I agree. And I think Haiti is one of those extreme examples of countries where the state just has no complete control, and there's non-state actors. In the case of Mexico, is gang cartels. It's the same now in Ecuador. I mean, unfortunately, it's a region where these actors do have a lot of power, and sometimes they're even the ones that supply everything that the state can't in isolated areas. And it's true that many people even support this type of organizations because that's the only thing that they can rely on. So it's a reality, and there's a lot of different dilemmas how to deal with them. Right back into the 2000s, the Mexican government decided to go on a fire against fire strategy that ended up in even more deaths and violence. So others go more for negotiations, talking to them, but at the same time, how can a government negotiate with these gangs, right? So it's a really complicated decision. And I think that a lot of leaders are now relying on authoritarian tactics to deal with these issues. I think El Salvador is a perfect example. So I think also that this is the perfect transition to go into our last section of the podcast and talk about these authoritarian leaders and countries and how they are taking these decisions and the consequences that they have. All right, well, entering this third and last block, I think there's a really interesting poll that takes place in Latin America. It's called the Latino Barometer. And it's this poll where respondents are asked how they can rate the approval of different leaders. And it was really interesting because in 15 out of the 17 countries surveyed, Bukele, El Salvador's populist and autocratic president, got the highest score. And this is a list that includes Pope Francis, Vladimir Zelensky. So I think it's a really interesting way to see and perceive how many young people, because this was mostly done for the younger population in the countries surveyed, and they support these tactics. No, so I think it's really interesting that leaders such as Bukele are getting a lot of support of how they are handling these security situations in their respective countries. But at the same time, it's no mystery that they are eroding the checks and balances that these countries have as well. There is that dilemma of people giving away their civil and liberty rights for the sake of having more security. So, Michael, I would like to ask you a little bit about that. How do you see these trends of leaders taking away those checks and balances in order to solve the issues? Do you think that is something that in the short term might give some results? But what do you think about those long-term consequences, and not just for the countries, but in the region in general?
Well, I think we're absolutely at a point in the region, in country after country, where people are very prepared to sacrifice individual protection and safeguards and due process and rule of law if they could get results, and especially on security. I mean, this is overwhelmingly the problem that's facing country after country, and even countries that just until recently were quite, where this wasn't a problem, in Chile, Uruguay, and others. This has really spread. I mean, organized crime is the overriding challenge in the region, and people want to be secure, understandably. And the fact is that there have been some successes in some countries. We can go to Medellin in Colombia, and we go to some cities in Brazil. But Bukele does provide an example, where homicides have been reduced dramatically. By the way, they were going down before he was elected and came to power, but they've gone down even more since he's come into office, and especially since March of 2022, when he declared a state of exception in El Salvador. We're at a point. It's not a point that I am happy about, but I certainly understand where many Latin Americans want above everything else security. And the fact is that democratic governments that are not authoritarian, like Bukele, have not really been very successful, at least at a national scale. So I think people are very drawn to at least the short-term positive outcomes of bringing down these levels of violence and being able to walk around without being in constant fear. At the same time, I think we've seen this movie before in Latin America. We know over the long term, this is really very, very troubling. We've seen the possibility of really, massive human rights violations and the nature of authoritarian rule in Latin America, which has a long history. And over time, people, I think, will become much more critical and much more disenchanted. But now they want to live in a secure environment, and But I mean, Bukele, in the case of El Salvador, Bukele is riding roughshod over all the institutions. And despite all the problems of El Salvadoran democracy since the peace accords in 1992 until Bukele was elected, you never had the armed forces entering Congress. You never had a lot of the things that we're seeing in El Salvador today. And I think it's troubling. And I think over the long term, it's going to have a lot of negative consequences. But people aren't thinking about the long term. They want immediate results, and one can hardly blame them.
I like the point you said about how we've seen this tale before in the region. And to conclude this block, we actually wanted to focus on countries that have been autocracies for a long, where democratic institutions have not had any power in decades. First, I want to talk about the case of Venezuela, where elections are scheduled for July 28, and the government of Nicolás Maduro has lately been arresting opponents allegedly tied to criminal plots. The most newsy case was Maria Corina Machado, who was arrested, and she was the head of the opposition coalition to contest against Nicolás Maduro in the election in July. Yesterday, Venezuela's main opposition coalition agreed to back Edmundo González as the challenger to Maduro. So I want to ask Michael, do you think that Edmundo González actually stands any chance against Maduro, or what do you think will happen in this election?
Well, this was I think, a development, a surprising development, I think a happy development, because the question has been whether the opposition was able to come up with a unified candidate who was able to register. And González was able to register. And so they rallied around him, and Manuel Rosales pulled out, who was a former presidential candidate. Obviously, Maria Corina also was prepared to support González. We'll see what happens now and how the regime responds. I find it difficult to envision a scenario in which the Chavismo is prepared to give up power in this election in 2024. I think that they feel quite strong and in a good position, even though Maduro is very unpopular. But he's been able to hold the regime together for 11 years now, over 11 years after Chavez died. And, the United States reimposed sanctions, but it's at a very general level. And what's interesting is the regime's reaction to the U.S. decision has not been too strong. So I think they feel like they're in a pretty good position, and they control the governments, and they control the governorships, and they control the bureaucracy, and they control the armed forces, which seems to be pretty much behind the regime. So we'll see what happens. I applaud the opposition for staying together and for picking a single candidate, but I don't think we should underestimate Chavismo finding a way to prevent that this election is going to be González against Maduro. I think we're gonna see some legal maneuvering and announcements probably in the next couple of weeks about this. But I would be very surprised, happily surprised, but surprised if there is a election between González, who's supported by the opposition, and Maduro, because I think in that case the government would have to resort to massive fraud in order to win, and I don't think this is something they really want to do. So I give credit to the opposition, but I also think the Maduro regime is stronger and more determined than I think many believe, just to hold on to power. And the main reason is, what happened? They don't trust that if they lose power, what's going to happen to them. These are, Maduro is wanted in the International Criminal Court. There's a case against him and a lot of officials in the United States, and there's been no negotiation and no protection. I don't know whether the regime and the military in particular would really trust any kind of a government with González. I think it's a big question. But I think this is a good development. But now we'll have to wait to see how the regime responds and what the consequences are.
That's very interesting. And there's definitely, as you said, a lot at stake for Nicolás Maduro in this election. It's not just holding on to power for the sake of it, but there would be tremendous consequences if he didn't. Quick question about following up on the opposition. Do you think there's signs of optimism in the sense that the opposition is more organized or has been gaining more popularity despite all efforts by Maduro to crack down on it?
Well, I think this, again, to their credit, they have been able to sort of, now there are different factions in the opposition, and over the course of Chavismo, over 25, we're talking about a quarter of a century, there are lots of differences in different political parties and different positions and a lot of personal rivalries and distrust and so forth. But I think the good news is that, for this election, remember, they boycotted previous elections, which took them out of the political game. Now they're at least in the political game and they're participating. They have not, said at all that they would not participate on July 28th. So they're going to be they are going to participate. And I think that's a good thing. And so I think there are differences, but I think for the time being, the opposition is sort of been able to sort of work this out so they all get behind a single candidate. That was the big question a few days ago. But now I think some in the opposition, and I know many of them and respect them, and certainly they've gone through a lot. But some of them are, I think, more optimistic that they see a path where they can actually come to power and take office, and that the Chavismo would let them do that if they have international support and so forth. And others are basically saying, well, this is a small step. We're not going to win on July 28th. But, there are elections next year in 2025 in Venezuela as well. There are local elections, governors, mayors, and so forth. So this is, beginning to take advantage of some of the cracks in Chavismo and trying to build more political support in the country. And they see that kind of scenario. So from my perspective, I think there are two different kind of views, at least two in the opposition. Some that see that they see the possibility of defeat of Maduro and then coming to power, and others see this as a longer term, more complicated process, but that is basically moving in the right direction.
Well, we'll take the small wins here. Lastly, we want to talk about Nicaragua. Fabio, I will let you introduce the topic and ask Michael some questions.
Well, Nicaragua is another country in the continent that has been ruled by a dictator the last 17 years. President Daniel Ortega is famous for those headlines about his human rights abuses, accusations for crimes against humanity, drug trafficking, insecurity, crackdown on opposition. So this is another case where a leader gets into power and then at the end they manage to destroy every democratic institution, every check and balance. But to be honest, I'm not that aware of how the situation is at the moment. And I don't know, Michael, if you have any insights how things are moving in Nicaragua, or where is it heading?
No, I think the situation in Nicaragua, I don't think there's been anything this egregious in the last 30 years in Latin America. And, there's a dictatorship, but I just never imagined that it would go to this extreme brutality. I mean, this is a police state, and certainly the worst human rights situation, I think, in all of Latin America, including Venezuela, including Cuba, and other, and other governments. It is just, I think there's been no limits to what Ortega and Rosario Murillo have gone to, extremes. And so there's been just, there's been a systematic crackdown and on the church, on universities, and there's absolutely no space at all. A lot of the opposition now is in exile. Many are in Costa Rica, many are elsewhere. I have a lot of friends who are Nicaraguans who are out of the country. Their citizenship was taken away. There's just no limit on what the regime and Ortega and Murillo are prepared to do. There have been lots of resolutions in the Organization of American States. There have been actions by the United States, by others. This is an indefensible situation, but Ortega is dug in, and he controls the means of control and repression in the country. And I don't see any really near-term prospect of dislodging him. I think, remember, Ortega was in power in the 1980s with the Sandinista regime as a result of the revolution, and there was an election in 1990, and he lost the election to Violeta Chamorro, and so when he came back to office in 2007, he was clearly determined that he was never going to lose an election again, because he had power and he had to give it up, and now he has power again and he's not going to give it up. And so I don't, unfortunately, this is a very, very sad and tragic situation for the Nicaraguan people, but I just don't see any solution.
No, yeah, me either. It's sad to see a country going in there, and I think it's important for everyone that might be listening to these podcasts have these ideas in their mind whenever they go to vote for a certain leader that's trying to present these type of short-term solutions, and that maybe to address security or economic challenges, certain parts of the democratic system need to maybe be blurred or put aside. Like we have to think about the long term, and that there are actual examples in the continent of dictators that have taken power like this, and then they will not drop their grip on power just like that. So Valeria, Michael, I think we've had a really interesting conversation. We went from north to south, east and west. We tried to cover so many issues. It's hard to talk about so many different countries, and each one of them is different. We need to understand the region as a whole, but at the end, every single country has way too many particular trends that might differ a lot. But I think it's really interesting that there are certain elements that can be analyzed together. And as a conclusion, I wanted to ask you, because it's true there's a couple exceptions of the rule. We talked about economic, political, and security challenges, but the case of Chile, Uruguay, and Costa Rica kind of are exceptions of the rule. So thinking about how and why these countries have done so well, how do you think that other countries in the region can maybe, what kind of solutions, what kind of policies you would recommend to their leaders that they could take? Valeria, I'll start with you. What would you recommend to the leaders? How do you think we could mitigate the crisis that we see today?
I'm going to reference Michael here. I really like what he said about the fact that some of the biggest crises that are facing the region are actually transnational issues, and they will require cooperation. So these divisive rhetoric and these populism politics where leaders want to claim that they can fix their issues by using by making their own choices about it, and can erode any institutional cooperation to fix these issues is completely unrealistic. So I think it is very important to remember that cooperation is going to be at the heart of any solution, and that these quick fixes or these suppressions or erosion of democratic norms and human rights in order to do a quick fix to security issues, for example, will have a long-term effect, and it will not necessarily fix what is at stake. It's a bit of a vague recommendation, but I really like that point that Michael raised. Michael, I want to hear what your recommendations would be.
Well, I teach a course in Georgetown on political leadership in Latin America, and I guess, I think the quality of leadership is crucial. And I think today, as we discussed earlier in this podcast, about some of the spectacle that's been going on recently is not very encouraging. And so, and really distracts from the task of governing. There's more performing in politics everywhere in the world, and let's put Latin America in a global context. Latin America is not unique in kind of the collapse of parties and populism and all of that. This is global, but it does have its particularities in Latin America. And Latin America has had better leadership, and I think it's suffered. So I think that needs to happen. I hope that, because there are many extraordinarily talented people in Latin America and with leadership qualities, but they don't want to get into politics, and that's unfortunate. So I hope that begins to change, because their country is politics is important, and whether you're talking about education or any issue, it's the politics of education or the politics of energy or the politics of health. You take your issue, all the things that are important in Latin America. It's not having a technical solution. It's, using politics to make it happen. That I think is where I think the region needs to focus on. And I hope that happens.
Yeah, me too. And something that I see a lot with colleagues of mine, young people that might not find themselves really interested in the politics, because it is true that it's, at least in Mexico, it's quite a violent and complicated and tiring topic to discuss. But at the end, it is important to foster political education and awareness how things are moving, and just to avoid these populist leaders to just buy your vote, to be aware how you vote and why you vote. But it is true what you say, Michael, that there's amazing and talented individuals, but they just don't want to get involved in this really nasty and dangerous game, at least in Mexico. It's really unfortunate, but I do believe that there are ways to move forward. And at the end, it will be the youth, the younger generations that will have to take the mantle in the coming years. So it's crucial for us to also be involved in these political debates and environments. Anyways, Valeria, Michael, I think that we had a great conversation. Thank you so very much for a Saturday evening of your time. And I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as me. I learned a lot. I want to think that I know a lot about my continent, but at the end, I always learn a bit more. So, Michael, I wish that I could take a couple classes, the ones you do there in Georgetown. I think I would learn a lot. So thank you so very much for being here today. We appreciate that a lot.
Thank you, Fabio. I really enjoyed it. And Valeria, thank you so much. It was a great pleasure. And congratulations on a great podcast.
Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us. I'm definitely regretting not taking any of your classes at Georgetown, as Fabio said, but hopefully we can continue to talk about Latin America in future episodes.
And for those listeners, we'll leave a couple links in the description of other episodes we've done, both in English and Spanish, about political trends in the continent. There's a couple about Ecuador, Salvador, and Mexico from recent months that are really interesting. So we'll leave you the links there. And you can follow us in social media or anywhere for more international relations and geopolitical analysis. Thank you so much, and have a nice one.